Hi, thank you for tuning in today. My name is Seth Gerson. I'm Program Director for K-12 Education at the National Governors Association. Welcome to NGA's webinar, Exploring Strategies for Supporting English Learners During and Beyond the COVID-19 Pandemic. Please note that this is the sixth in an ongoing Reflect and Redesign series of NGA webinars that will continue to explore lessons learned during the pandemic and elevate state and local exemplars that can inform gubernatorial efforts for improving the K-12 education system during and beyond COVID. Please check out our earlier webinars on state education budgeting, re-engaging students, summer learning and enrichment, and addressing the unique needs of students with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness, Native American students, all of which can be found on the NGA website, nga.org. Today, I'm honored to engage in a conversation with two national experts in this area from New America. Amaya Garcia is Deputy Director, and Leslie Villegas is a Senior Policy Analyst, both primarily focused on English learners in pre-K through 12 education within the Education Policy Program at New America. Amaya and Leslie, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. Before we dive into specific questions, can each of you talk about how you came to this work, how you came to focus on English learners, and your personal connection to it?
Sure, thanks, Seth. I came upon this job just by luck, to be honest. I was looking for a new position and I saw the posting and was interested in learning about this population of students. I actually didn't know a lot about English learners coming into the job, and so have benefited greatly from the expertise of others in helping me shape my own knowledge of this population of students. But for me, it was definitely a personal endeavor to focus on English learners. My family immigrated here when I was 3 years old from South America, and my sister was older than me, and she entered school as an English learner, actually got retained in kindergarten because of her lack of English proficiency, but obviously very quickly became proficient in English. And for me, since I was younger, I actually lost a lot of our home language, which was Spanish. And so I've had to spend some of my adulthood kind of rebuilding those skills. And so for me, it's been really meaningful to better understand not just the needs of English learners, but to be able to visit dual language classrooms, for example, where English learners are provided with instruction in English and their home language and are able to maintain their bilingualism and ultimately have an experience different from my own.
Yeah, hi Seth. So thanks for having us here today. My name is Leslie Villegas. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at New America, and similar to Amaya, I kind of stumbled upon this role, but I think I, for a long time, had decided that I wanted to work in education policy. I actually started my career in working for the California legislature, and all of the issues that we ended up working on from a policy perspective always came back to education for me. And so I knew that I wanted to work or focus my attention on that area, specifically for immigrant kids, because I was also an English learner when I was growing up in California in the 90s. So this issue was something that was always close to me. I just didn't know what was going to lead me to this work. I started working on this at MPI back in 2017, and I have been focusing on this issue area ever since.
Well, thank you both for sharing those experiences and stories of your pathway. It's always helpful as we sort of start the conversation and as listeners and watchers, get to know as we dive into the conversation. So as we dive into some specific topic areas, as you know, I'll start with sort of the digital divide. As you know, governors have focused extensively on closing the digital divide and addressing those inequities in devices, connectivity, internet access for students, educators, and families during the pandemic. What have you seen as some of the challenges for English learners engaged in remote or hybrid learning during school building closures? And what are some strategies you've seen or recommendations you have for improving connectivity and digital literacy for English learners, their families, and their communities?
So I'm going to be taking this question, but before we kick this off, I would like to provide a little bit of context about who English learners are, just for the audience. So ELLs make up about 10% of the K through 12 population. Over 1/3 of the under 8 population in the US are considered English learners. The majority of ELLs are US born. They speak a variety of languages, with Spanish being the most prominent one, but top languages also vary by state and district. And there are ELLs in every state, with rapidly growing populations in non-traditional states. So our team at New America created an interactive hub with state-by-state fact sheets that provide this and other information that may be helpful. And we work specifically on ELL issues. And over the last month and a half, we've been conducting research to reflect on how COVID impacted ELLs education, and also trying to look forward at how the system can support them more effectively moving forward. So the answers that we're going to be providing today are heavily influenced by those conversations as well. So just to get back to the question on the digital divide, it seems to have occurred on various fronts. So I'll start with the most immediate, which was the connection needs, such as devices and internet access. Education leaders we spoke to shared that in the beginning, they were focused on getting a device in the hands of every student and making sure they had access to the internet, which in hard to reach areas was most often done by creating hotspots via school buses or other vehicles. We also heard countless stories of teachers making home visits and walking students and parents through how to use the new technology, and just making a tremendous effort to get kids connected. But even then, that didn't guarantee that parents were prepared to help their kids use the new tools, which in the case of the youngest learners is critical for them to be able to engage in remote learning. So we heard a lot about parent and family engagement going virtual, and how that brought schools and families together in a new way. For English learners, this was most beneficial when language support is also provided for their parents, and many leaders spoke about the need for translation and interpretation services for lower incidence languages. But hotspots are supposed to be temporary. They're not a replacement for permanent Wi-Fi infrastructure. And I think that as students return to in-person learning, we must not revert back to ignoring the fact that many families do not have access to the internet. And we've also heard that some schools and districts have taken devices back, and that puts students right back where they were before the pandemic and being disconnected. And then there's the need to also integrate language and content for English learners in a remote setting. Many of the approaches historically used to make curriculum more accessible for ELLs simply weren't possible in a virtual classroom. And most people we talked to alluded to the fact that all teachers became ELL teachers during the pandemic. So in a way, the pandemic accelerated the common understanding that language and content go hand in hand. Teachers had to be more strategic about how they group students together for Zoom breakouts and figure out what needs to be done synchronously and what can be done on their own, particularly for the older students. And the vision of instruction really drove how technology was used, and teachers learned how to make lessons more interactive using videos, for example, that actually turned out to be great for ELLs. So in a way, the pandemic also accelerated the technological learning for not just students, but for teachers and parents and administrators. But the pandemic also highlighted the fact that curriculum that many districts were using before the pandemic did not provide enough language supports for ELLs. Local and state education leaders must reevaluate their curriculum to see whether they take an integrated approach or if ELLs are treated as an afterthought, and provide more time for general education and ELL specialists to plan and collaborate on a cohesive vision for how they instruct ELLs, which will benefit ELLs in the near and the long term. And the places that fared better from what we heard in terms of learning consistency and coherence were the places that had a strong curriculum plan pre-pandemic and were committed to seeing that through in remote settings. And lastly, in terms of the digital divide, making sure students showed up and what to do when they didn't was critically important. How student engagement, participation, and attendance was measured shifted dramatically. It was not uncommon for ELLs to keep their camera and mic off during class. And one teacher shared that they didn't see one of their students' faces until the end of the school year. So technology allowed students to engage with their work in a variety of ways. And I think we need to be careful not to revert back to old habits, which, to be honest, were not inclusive of ELs and their diverse needs. This is particularly true for older students who we saw taking on more responsibilities outside of the home as parents were not able to work. We've heard that just as a lot of flexibility was given at the beginning and throughout the pandemic on things like attendance and scheduling, it has also been taken away now that things are being treated as back to normal. And that is a huge missed opportunity. Local and state leaders shared that many EL students simply disappeared throughout the pandemic, and reconnecting and establishing direct lines of communication with parents will be critical in getting as many of these students back in the classroom.
Thanks, Leslie. Very helpful. And I really appreciate you right up front speaking to the range of English learners that we're talking about as we dive into this conversation. And you mentioned the interactive hub, and we'll be sure listeners, viewers, to include that resource attached to this webinar. And I think your point there around student engagement and really taking the lessons learned, some of the positive outcomes that we've seen is during the pandemic, really harnessing that as we move back to in-person learning, not losing some of the good things that have happened during the pandemic, especially for English learners. I want to shift a little bit to academic recovery. We've all heard about the unfinished learning, the learning gaps for students as a result of the pandemic. What do those gaps look like for English learners, and what recommendations do you have for addressing some of those academic recovery efforts? Is summer, which is an area that governors are looking at as they try to plan next summer and facilitate some of those partnerships at the local level, do you see that as a leverage point for addressing some of the academic recovery?
So I'm also going to take this one. So apologies for having to hear me speak for so long. But on the language side, one of the state leaders that we talked to candidly shared that there's no such thing as a gap in a developmental process like language learning. And I think that is an important clarification that should be made to shift the conversation to a more asset-based approach. Language learning is not linear, and we need to stop talking about it as if it is, because that creates a deficit-based lens from the beginning. That being said, local educators must invest the time and resources upfront to figure out and assess where their EL students are in their language journey, coming back after so much time in remote settings, to build a plan forward rather than looking backwards. State and local education leaders should be looking at their English language proficiency assessment data from this last year and disaggregate it by various characteristics like age, grade, ELP level, economically disadvantaged status, dual identification as a student with disabilities, long-term ELs, newcomers, and students with limited or interrupted formal education, because not all ELs have the same level of need. And disaggregating the data will allow education leaders to identify how to differentiate support for those various different subgroups of ELs. From our conversations, we gathered that more ELs than expected were able to take the test in 2021, so there should be a good amount of data to work with. We also heard that while some of the remote teaching strategies helped ELs with receptive skills like listening, the same cannot be said about productive skills like speaking and writing. So as students have more in-person instruction time, we need to focus on giving them more opportunities to use those skills. Language is also experienced socially, and students didn't have enough opportunities to connect with each other in remote settings. So creating those opportunities for peer-to-peer learning, I think, are critical as we move forward, both academically and for social emotional health. We've also heard that while English learners may not have had the same opportunities to practice their English skills, being home for such an extended period of time gave them a lot of exposure to their home languages and many of them grew more proficient in those languages as a result. Research has shown that proficiency in their home language or their first language can support growth in a second language like English, and it is up to state and local education leaders to figure out how to best capitalize on that unexpected benefit of the pandemic and also continue to support the development in those languages. From a content side, like math, science, and English language arts, many representatives shared that they're not particularly concerned about this learning loss narrative because it is so deficit oriented and it's really, to them, it's really unclear who they're trying to catch these students up to. Like, is it their pre-pandemic selves or pre-pandemic peers? Like, who is it that we're trying to catch up to, right? So instead of trying to mirror pre-pandemic performance, students, including ELs, need to be re-engaged in education, and local and state education leaders need to ensure that they're using integrated language supports in the curriculum and instruction materials beyond the antiquated pull-out or add-on packets that you see everywhere, and also making sure that that content is rigorous and relevant to the students, so like age and grade appropriate. I would also say that states and districts should be looking at ELs that were recently reclassified, so maybe the year prior to the pandemic or last year, if that was possible, because if those students are not provided with adequate support, they can often stagnate or even regress in their language development, which then affects their ability to access a curriculum. And the repercussions just go on from there. We've also heard a lot about additional learning time, such as like you mentioned, summer and after school programs. But from our conversations with education leaders, it is unclear how these programs are being tailored to or being inclusive of EL's academic and language needs. So if those programs are going to be pursued, it's really important that there's a special consideration and for these students, because if that's not happening, then these are just going to be additional places where ELs are going to be left out. And ultimately, though, whether ELs recover, if you want to call it that, will depend on the common understanding that and acceptance that they are everyone's responsibility, not just the English learner teachers and specialists. And we cannot go back to how things were before in many places where language and content were treated as mutually exclusive learning experiences.
Thanks, Leslie. Very helpful. And, I think as you were speaking around, tailoring summer experiences or academic recovery efforts really speaks to ensuring that the voices of students and families and parents and communities of English learners are really part of that conversation, a key governor role, and making sure that there's a broad representation so that the particular needs are being heard out and part of the planning process and development process. One thing before we move on, you mentioned you're seeing some of these parts, and maybe this isn't in the interactive hub, but is there states or districts that are already, some bright spots that are moving in that sort of asset-based framing that you were speaking to, that, as governor's offices sort of look to elevating some examples from across the country? Are there a few that you would point to look at?
It has been really difficult to kind of pinpoint, and we'll get into this when we talk about ESSER funds, but it's been really difficult to pinpoint specific things that have been done. I think a lot of people have been in kind of a holding pattern, trying to make sure that they use those funds in the best way possible. And I feel like a lot of what we heard, we talked to the Internationals Network, for example, and this was said in other districts as well, is the places that have been able to kind of push forward with like best practices were schools and districts that already had really strong systems in place beforehand. So it's not like they're reinventing or coming up with something new. It is they had a very strong model or strategy beforehand, and have been able to kind of go push through that in a remote setting, and are now kind of pushing it through as they come back into in-person learning. So it's a really hard thing to pinpoint there.
Thanks, Leslie. And one of the things you mentioned in prior was about not only addressing the academic recovery needs, but also the social emotional, with students being out, and that sort of increased fear and anxiety and stress that has been felt by students and families over this past 20 months or so. And we know that disproportionately impacted English learners and their families during this time. Can you speak a bit to either of you, English learners' holistic and mental health needs right now, and how are you seeing? You mentioned a little bit about parent outreach, but how schools are re-engaging the English learners during this time and engaging parents and families and communities as part of these efforts.
Sure. So many of the practitioners we have spoken with have highlighted the need to provide EL students and frankly all students with better social emotional support and more wraparound support in general. Prior to the pandemic, some school districts had already started to make investments in trauma-informed interventions and related professional development for their teachers, and are now having to double down on those investments. Some have been very frank and framed it as a need for more mental health support. And that's a challenge because there isn't some product or intervention that you can just buy to address that issue. As one person in Virginia told us in relation to how ESSER recovery funds, how she wants to use them, she's told us very clearly is that she's not interested in buying anything new or fancy. She's not a product person. She wants more mental health support, more instructional support, and more first language support. But all of those have to be found, right? Those are all people, and they all have to be people who work in person and who are trained and have the skills necessary to support English learners in particular. So in other words, being bilingual. But looking through the other kinds of needs that EL students have, I mean, they really benefit from being in classrooms with their peers and teachers. I mean, there's no doubt about that, particularly our youngest learners. And drawing on what Leslie said earlier, the research really does emphasize the role that peer modeling and peer learning can play in helping facilitate EL's language development. As one person we spoke with told me, interacting with the peer influences how students apply new content and how they master new material. So just being back, I think, in the classroom is one way that EL's needs are being met, to be honest. And so many of the strategies used to promote oral language development and speaking were very difficult to execute via remote learning. And in some ways, some school districts are actually kind of having to go back to basics. I recently moderated a conversation with EL program leads in 4 school districts, and some of them spoke candidly about having to start at the beginning with teachers in terms of the types of strategies that can be used to support ELs in the classroom. Things like turn and talk or pair and share, which were much harder to do via remote learning, especially for young kids. And so in some cases, it's really just about returning back to basics and providing ELs with language-rich environments that can really help them thrive. In addition, re-engaging ELs honestly means screening and identifying them for language services. This is a gap that happened during the pandemic because those are procedures that really need to happen in person. And so many districts spent the early months of this school year simply engaging in the work of figuring out who is an EL, what level of English proficiency do they have, and linking them up with appropriate language supports and instructional programs. We spoke with someone in Chicago and he told us that they had to screen 19,000 ELs at the beginning of the school year, which is a big job, but a really important part of re-engaging them in the school process. One way that schools and districts can better engage ELs and their families is through welcome centers that can serve as one-stop locations for enrollment, screening, and accessing other community services. And during the pandemic, that includes information about COVID testing and vaccines. It's really important that welcome centers have bilingual staff so that the information is accessible to many families. Bilingual homeschool liaisons are another essential strategy for connecting families with schools and teachers. These liaisons can provide direct support and communication to families, and districts often endeavor to hire liaisons directly from the community and who speak the primary languages of ELs and their families. In other words, these are individuals who may have been refugees or immigrated to the country are now working in the school system to provide direct services and to support to other new arrivals in linguistically diverse families. They are often an essential bridge between schools and families. And I've heard a lot of stories of home liaisons literally knocking on doors to check in with families and make sure that they have all the resources and support that they need. And pulling a little bit more on what Leslie said earlier, I think I've really learned that schools must be intentional about their own culture and the ways in which they interact with families and students. As someone in New York shared with us, the schools that fared better during remote learning were those that had highly collaborative cultures and relationships between adults in the building, but also a high level of awareness of the needs of students and families. We want school buildings to be places that promote innovation and collaboration amongst teachers, provide them with time to plan and learn together, and where culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy is leveraged to build strong relationships between teachers and students, but also between teachers and students' families.
Thanks, Amaya. Really helpful in those specific examples and what you've heard from practitioners and families. And as you've done some of this research is really helpful for hearing those welcome centers, the home liaisons, the back to basics of, some of the things that got lost during this pandemic, to bring that back and then build upon that to what we've learned during the pandemic works during this time, including teacher collaboration and different ways to do so, the working conditions that happen in a school. You spoke around some of the people shortages, and that's where I'd like to move next. This is an area that we're increasingly getting questions and concerns around, is staffing shortages and a worry about that happening across the system. How is that impacting English learners, and do you have any recommendations particularly to English learners on addressing those teaching needs?
Yeah, so districts across the country are facing shortages of paraeducators, which has big implications for the depth of services that can be offered to English learner students. EL students often benefit from small group instruction, whereby they can get more targeted language support, receive a preview of upcoming lessons and relevant vocabulary, and other academic assistance. These small groups are often led by paraeducators who play a multifaceted role in supporting EL students and their families, not just a small group instruction, but they also can facilitate translation and communication. And in some settings, they are really the only adult that can provide instructional support in a student's home language. So the need for paraeducators is acute, and I think that's one aspect of the workforce that we really need to spend more time developing. They're one of the most underpaid staff in schools, and so I think there needs to be more attention to not just paying them more, but helping them gain more professional skills and competencies because of the important role that they play in not only supporting EL students, but other vulnerable students, such as those with special education needs. But even prior to the pandemic, a majority of states reported shortages of English as a second language and bilingual teachers. And many states were experiencing other subject area shortages, including special education. And I have to point out that about 15% of ELs also qualify for special education services. So they're sort of being duly impacted by these kinds of shortages. What these shortages mean is that ELs have differential access to specialized instructional services and programs to support their language and academic development. So in areas with low incidences of EL, specialized ESL teachers are often spread across buildings and able to only devote a few hours a day to working with ELs in each school. While in other localities, schools might have multiple ESL teachers on staff full-time who are able to provide differentiated support to meet a variety of needs. For example, running programs for newcomer students who are recent arrivals to this country, providing small group instruction with for ELs with higher levels of English proficiency, and co-teaching with general education teachers. And so because of the variability in who is available, you end up having a lot of variability in what schools can offer. In relation to the bilingual teacher shortage in particular, we see that play out in the data on the number of ELs and different types of instructional programs. So according to the most recent biennial report to Congress on Title III, which is the federal funding stream that provides direct support for ELs, across about 42 states, about 800,000 ELs are enrolled in a dual language immersion program. So that's a program that allows them to learn English and continue with their home language. Or a bilingual program, compared to approximately 3.3 million ELs who are enrolled in some type of English language development program that provides them with instruction pretty much only in English. In other words, the lack of bilingual teachers has meant that school districts are limited in terms of how many and what types of bilingual programs they can offer. States and districts have faced such challenges in finding bilingual teachers that they have turned to recruiting and hiring teachers from abroad to help staff their programs, which is not a highly sustainable strategy. And they've also had to be very creative about how to attract local bilingual teachers by providing hiring bonuses or higher salaries. But the need is very real and is only really been exacerbated by the pandemic. And increasingly, we are seeing anecdotal reports of high rates of teacher attrition due to a variety of factors. And I'm not just talking about teachers who are leaving before the school year starts. I'm talking about teachers who are leaving as the school year is already happening and is already underway. Teachers are stressed like never before. And unfortunately, some states have enacted policies that have made teachers' jobs even harder. And I think the implications go beyond gaps in current services that can be offered to EL students, not just bilingual ed, but to interest in pursuing a career as a teacher and retention in the profession overall. If we don't find a way to kind of solve this crisis that we're in, we're just going to continually face these kinds of shortages. So state leaders should really be attuned to the working conditions that teachers face and develop policies such as higher pay that will not just help attract new teachers, but keep existing teachers in the classroom.
Thanks, Amaya, and really good suggestions there. Paying attention to your paraeducator pool in particular, as one slice of the workforce, and just particularly in the area of ELLs, and then the intersections between students with disabilities and as part of the English learner population, and then this last point that we've been hearing a lot more as well on staff and educator well-being, and paying attention to that, not only for a retention issue, but also making it more attractive for teachers to enter, individuals to enter the profession that we need. We've had so many challenges over these past 20 months. We always try to sort of end these webinars with a note of optimism. So what are you most excited about going forward? We know there's been unprecedented federal funding during this time to address some of the needs we've talked about today. So what are you most looking forward to, and how can governors think about using those federal funding in particular to leverage some of the changes we've spoken about today?
Yeah, Seth, so it's a great question. And like I mentioned before, it has been really difficult to pinpoint exactly how federal stimulus funding has been used to address the particular needs and challenges of ELs. And that's interesting because they are consistently highlighted as one of the groups that, should be, that states and districts should be focusing on the most. So, that disconnect there is an interesting observation I think that we've all made. But in many cases, the Title III and Title L directors have not been involved in these decisions, from what we've heard, which gives me, unfortunately, little hope that members from the community have been consulted, because I know that was also supposed to be a priority. That being said, I was really reassured, like Amaya said, in our conversations with local and state EL education leaders, when they stated that they didn't just want to buy more things, but are rather more interested in investing in systemic and human needs that can better serve ELs now and in the future. There's an opportunity here to assess why and how these services for these students were falling short before the pandemic, made worse by it, and then build on things that have been proven to be successful, like you mentioned earlier. I did one example that has one of the few examples, I guess, that we've been able to gather. In Washington, the state set aside $10 million from the ESSER funds to invest in existing or future dual language programs, which just shows their commitment to building out those programs that they know have been successful for their English learner students. And for me, just broadly thinking, I think this massive influx of funding is giving educators and administrators space to envision what adequately funding education can look like, which the counter of that, is realizing that you've been undercutting it for a long time. Maybe this will be the catalyst to improve how we fund education at the local and state level moving forward. And I think that, to me, is a thing to be optimistic about.
Yeah, and part of our research is actually involved asking about the silver linings that emerged from the pandemic, because we also want to make sure that we're thinking about this in a balanced way. It's not just about all the terrible things that happened, but what positive things may have come out of this terrible time. And one consistent response we heard, as Leslie mentioned before, was that ELs were able to spend more time immersed in exposed to their home languages. And I think we've really reached a point where the research on the role of home language in supporting EL's language development and the benefits of bilingual instruction on EL's not just language development, but academic outcomes is very, very clear. And so I'm hopeful that more school systems will begin embracing these findings and translating them into the types of programs and services offered to ELs. And I think that the national conversation around ELs is very slowly becoming more asset oriented. And so meaning that we're less focused on the skills that they lack, and the conversation is moving towards being more focused on the considerable assets that they bring to the classroom, including their bilingualism. And so I always like to think that very slowly but surely we're seeing all that these students have to offer, as opposed to always worrying about what they don't have. And I personally believe that state leaders should direct ESSER funds to help develop the teacher workforce. So Tennessee, for example, utilized $6.5 million in recovery funds to develop a competitive grant program to spur the development and expansion of grow your own educator programs that recruit community members such as paraeducators and provide them with a cost-free pathway and other wraparound supports to becoming a teacher. Tennessee's program also mandates that teachers who receive the funding must either earn an endorsement in special education or English as a second language, which is a very clever strategy to help address shortages in those content areas. And obviously GYO can also be utilized to develop bilingual teachers. I've been lucky enough to visit several programs and hear directly from participants about the positive impact that these programs have had on their lives and career trajectories. And I'm actually very excited that Grow Your Own is included in the Build Back Better framework. And we've seen other bills that might be coming down the pipeline from on the federal side. And so I think the strategy is gaining a lot of momentum. And I think it can provide a useful way of really addressing some of these issues with our teacher workforce.
Well, thank you both. Those are great ideas. And I'm so glad you mentioned Tennessee, because, it is for educator workforce, that is one of the states that we return to because of the successive administrations, Republican and Democratic, since the early 2000s, that have really, handed the ball to one another and continued some of the momentum in the area of educator workforce. And so great to hear that they're continuing those positive efforts. So thank you both for the conversation today and your great insights. Again, listeners, watchers, we'll make sure that we attach all the resources discussed today, related resources to the webinar recording when it's released on the website and on social media. But until next time, stay well, stay healthy, and have a great day. Thanks for joining us.